Shakespeare is a name that typically calls to mind illuminated stages, emotion-packed sonnets, and works that capture, perhaps more than any other, the very essence of humanity. Yet there is a lesser explored facet of this great playwright, his final wish. When people think about last wishes, they usually imagine grandiose inheritances or spiritual guidelines. In his case, however, the item that draws the most attention is surprisingly simple: the second best bed he bequeathed to his wife. Many wonder why a man so masterful with words would reduce his goodbye to something seemingly trivial. Some suspect a hint of irony or a gesture that goes beyond the obvious. Imagine someone close to you, in their will, specifically leaving the object that symbolizes intimacy and routine, yet isn't the best one. Would it sound like an insult or like a subtle homage to a shared moment? To grasp its significance, it's worth remembering that beds at the time had great financial and emotional value. Moreover, the fact that he wrote this so plainly into his will suggests that Shakespeare wasn't merely making cold decisions about assets. He was sending a message meant to span generations. Anyone who loves unraveling literary mysteries finds in this unassuming second-best bed one of the most intriguing clues about the bard's genuine sentiments. It's almost as if every rhyme he ever wrote joined together at this moment to form an enigmatic declaration of affection or subtle humor. And intriguingly, despite all the theories in biographers' commentary, no one can say with absolute certainty what his true intention was. For some, it's just a minor detail. For others, it says far more about the man behind the verses than it does about his fortune. It's precisely at this junction that we begin to understand the complexity of a genius's legacy. It's not limited to spotlights, but also dwells in the slightest of gestures that endure forever. For some researchers, this action by Shakespeare is tantamount to a mini-chapter of his plays, in which a seemingly harmless line can harbor profound meanings. The playwright, whose genius transformed lives and influenced generations, appears to have chosen a detail that prompts us to reflect on how simple things can hold immense value. Like a Shakespearean character on the verge of a secret disclosure, his will leaves open the possibility of a marital reconciliation, a touch of humor, or even a veiled rebuke. Anne Hathaway, his wife, would be the recipient of this final message. But what kind of message was it? Some argue that the second best bed was actually the couple's own bed, thus a symbol of companionship and shared love. Others insist it was a jab, something like, "You can have whatever's left over because the best belongs to someone or something else." This mystery continues to spark debate, uniting inquisitive minds, literature buffs, and even those who only discovered the playwright in school, but never realized that this seemingly minor detail could be so captivating. In the end, it becomes evident that even a literary genius's last wishes don't escape multiple interpretations. Perhaps that's the most secret magic of Shakespeare's legacy. Not everything must be plainly stated, for there is beauty in leaving room for the imagination. And if you're curious to understand how this request ties into Shakespeare's intricate dual nature, be aware that much more remains to be revealed about his emotions, contradictions, and, above all, the context in which he lived. After all, if in his plays the author taught us to find depth in every scene, he could hardly have acted differently in his own life. Shakespeare was not only the master of the stage and of poetry, but also a man of his time, born into an England in the midst of transformation. He came into the world in 1564, in a Stratford-upon-Avon that combined rural traditions with new influences from growing trade. Shakespeare's family was not noble, but they enjoyed a certain local standing. His father, John Shakespeare, worked as a glover, involving himself in small business ventures and civic matters. His mother, Mary Arden, came from a family of somewhat prosperous farmers, which gave young William a stable foundation. In childhood, he attended the local school, where it is believed he studied Latin, rhetoric, and classical literature, knowledge that provided a solid base for him. Though there are no detailed records of this period, it's supposed that the boy spent every spare moment reading stories, listening to folk tales, and observing the simple countryside life. That contrast between an emerging urban environment and calm rural landscapes likely inspired him to create vivid scenes in his future works. The scant documentation about his youth leaves blanks that fuel the imagination. Some historians suggest he worked with his father, while others see him as an early theater enthusiast. What is certain is that Stratford provided Shakespeare with a portrait of English society. There were religious tensions, commercial disputes, and an overall climate of intellectual discovery. Thus the boy strolling along the banks of the River Avon found before him a broad scene of human behaviors, mannerisms, and dramas. Some of his works, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, seem to echo that rural setting, while other, more urban plays reflect the ambition and excitement of the era. This immersion in British roots did not stop him from seeking greater heights once he decided to move to London. Before that, however, there's a period biographers call the lost years, because no one knows for sure what he did between adolescence and his arrival in the capital. Some speculate he was a tutor, a soldier, or even a budding actor in traveling troupes. What we do know is that, by the time he finally emerged in London's theatrical scene, he already possessed a keen eye for human behavior. That sharp observation would become the trademark of his plays, in which kings, princesses, blacksmiths, and commoners appear in profound coexistence. His ability to depict every social stratum has roots in his multifaceted experience, both in the countryside and in the metropolis. Additionally, being the son of a tradesman with some degree of formal education may have enabled him to move smoothly across different classes. In that way, Shakespeare arose as a mirror of his time, reflecting dreams, fears, and hopes amid political and religious conflicts. None of this, however, placed him beyond life's difficulties. He faced the need to support his family and endure criticism from literary rivals. This blend of everyday realism with artistic skill was already hinting at itself in his early verses, even though they didn't yet display the power of his later works. For those studying personal development, it's inspiring to see how he absorbed everything around him, turning mundane experiences into sparks of creativity. Even without realizing that his text would traverse centuries, he allowed himself to dive into what we now call active observation. It's a valuable lesson in any professional field. The more we perceive the core of what's happening around us, the greater the chance we have to create something universal. And it was precisely this spirit of curiosity that led him, step by step, to become the most influential playwright in the English language. Hence, the secret seems to have lay in a blend of simple life, self-taught study, and openness to the unpredictable. Some say he flirted with genius as well as with insecurities and fears, something evident in the melancholic tone of certain characters. That duality was not confined to his plays. It followed him throughout his life, culminating in decisions that would surprise many, even in his personal domain. Moving to London represented a decisive leap. The city was abuzz with novelties arriving from across Europe, and theater was among the populace's great passions. Shakespeare, seeing an opportunity to cement his career, whether as an actor or a writer, headed to the capital. At this time, the theater scene was packed with roaming troupes, taverns turned stages, and improvised arenas on the outskirts. With talent and a fair amount of boldness, he managed to join respected troupes, working alongside other creative minds and learning the tricks of stage design, rehearsals, and audience rapport. It's interesting to note that, at the end of the 16th century, England was experiencing the Elizabethan era, with Queen Elizabeth of Fern offering relatively stable support for the arts. This period of greater creative freedom allowed Shakespeare to write texts that engaged with political and social realities. Even so, censorship did exist, and many plays had to pass muster with the authorities. The playwright, however, had the skill to handle controversial topics without naming names, resorting to metaphors and symbols. Amid this kaleidoscope of influences, he began writing more consistently, throwing himself into the competitive artistic scene. Early plays like The Comedy of Errors and The Taming of the Shrew suggest beginnings in light comedies, though they already hint at the depth that was to come. Curiously, while many authors of the time stuck to a single genre, Shakespeare dabbled in tragedies, comedies, historical dramas, and even so-called romances. That versatility set him apart, for the same mind that crafted humorous dialogues was also adept at leading darker, reflective plotlines. In this cultural ferment, Shakespeare also learned to navigate growing popularity, realizing his signature sold tickets. This opened the door to lucrative partnerships, including co-ownership in theatrical companies, such as the renowned Lord Chamberlain's Men, which would later become the King's Men. Yet that professional ascent did not shield him from personal challenges. Life in the big city was not easy. Diseases spread quickly. Competition among authors was fierce. And on some occasions, theater activities were banned due to outbreaks of plague. During those times, Shakespeare was forced to halt performances and seek alternative means of making a living. Some historians suggest that's when he turned his focus to writing sonnets. These lyrical verses, sometimes addressed to a fair youth, other times to a dark lady, reveal a more introspective side of the writer, grappling with passion, jealousy, and the passage of time. Here we begin to discern his complex soul. The man who made audiences laugh also knew how to translate disillusionment into words that strike the heart. It's not surprising that, while gaining fame, he was also harboring secrets. His love life and true motives remain shrouded in mystery to this day. For anyone seeking practical lessons, it's evident that even those who aim to excel in their career may need a dose of introspection to refresh their ideas. From all indications, Shakespeare alternated between lively camaraderie in theater backstages and quiet sessions of writing and pondering. After all, an author can't live solely on applause. He also has to nurture his soul with more contemplative thoughts. That balance seems to have been crucial to the range and variety of his works, which could be at once distinct and deeply human. Still, all the initial success was, in many ways, regarded as popular entertainment rather than refined art, a status that would come later. It shows that a long-term perspective is essential. What starts as entertainment may become a worldwide reference if it has genuine emotion and consistency behind it. Thus, the seeds of his massive legacy were planted, but the fullness of his impact had yet to be realized. As Shakespeare solidified his position, he began to write ever more challenging pieces, naturally balancing tension and comedy. At that time, masterpieces like Romeo and Juliet emerged, blending youthful tragedy with lighter moments. By telling the story of two lovers from feuding families, he mingled deep themes, hate, love, and fate, into a play that remains timely. Among scholars, there is particular admiration for the way he manipulated language, puns, alliterations, and references to Greco-Roman culture. Even people outside England recognize the universal appeal of these narratives that address family conflicts and forbidden passions. Besides Romeo and Juliet, he produced historical dramas such as Richard II, Henry IV, and Henry V, in which he explored power, honor, and the battles shaping the nation. He relied on memorable characters and sweeping scenes to depict monarchy, revealing the humanity behind royal crowns. It's remarkable that, though his focus was on kings and nobles, he never lost sight of the humor and wit of common folk, introducing plebeian figures who brought warmth and levity to the stories. This layering of social strata in his plays made them accessible to both the upper class and the more humble audience. In Elizabethan theaters, crowds were diverse, from nobles seated in galleries to ordinary folk standing in the yard, or the pit. Shakespeare thus perfected the art of entertaining everyone simultaneously, a feat that calls for vision and the ability to appeal to varied tastes without losing consistency. Anyone looking to draw from his techniques can notice how he always aimed to grip the spectator with emotional conflicts and near-poetic dialogue. This enticing style continually evolved. Soon he undertook weightier tragedies such as Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. In these, he delved into humanity's darkest areas: revenge, greed, jealousy, madness. Even as he exposed the depths of the psyche, he inserted seemingly simple scenes that contrasted with the otherwise heavy atmosphere. A practical example is Hamlet, interweaving philosophical reflections with moments of biting humor to keep the audience's attention engaged. For communicators, that interplay can inspire how to craft content both intense and light, reaching diverse audiences. It's as if Shakespeare was perpetually testing boundaries, playing with expectations, and introducing fresh perspectives with each act. No one better than he to illustrate the power of authenticity. Even under censorship or social constraints, it is possible to weave profound queries into a narrative. On the other hand, one shouldn't forget that he still faced personal dilemmas alongside fame. He married an older woman, Anne Hathaway, fathered children, including a son who died young. Such losses and joys inevitably found their way into his creative domain, adding layers of melancholy and introspection. It's probable that the premature death of his son Hamnet influenced how he addressed fatherhood and grief in his works. None of this prevented him from expanding his career. He participated in building the Globe Theatre in 1599, where many of his great plays were first staged. An open-air theater, the Globe became a cultural landmark, drawing throngs of eager spectators to see the bard's offerings. To finance it all, Shakespeare also acted as an entrepreneur, investing in shares of his theatrical group, ensuring both earnings and creative independence. Through such measures, he could produce work without relying solely on patrons, though he kept cordial ties with key figures of the court. Balancing creativity and entrepreneurship stands as a valuable lesson for those who believe art and business can't mix. It was precisely that combination of literary talent, business savvy, and profound experiences that would elevate him even further in due course. During the reign of James I, Shakespeare's company took the name the King's Men, signifying official royal patronage. That meant the royal court expected first-rate performances, and the playwright had to maintain the caliber of his creations. Interestingly, even under this new title, the plays still focused on timeless human anxieties, refusing to become mere political propaganda. Here we observe his deftness in navigating tensions between authority and artistic freedom, something few accomplish so gracefully. Works from this period, such as The Tempest, reveal an exceptional literary maturity, contemplating forgiveness, vengeance, and reconciliation. In that play, the character Prospero, a magician isolated on an island, seems to reflect Shakespeare's own state of mind, which some argue was turning toward the twilight of his career. It raises questions about how much of the author's own life was woven into his plots. Might Prospero mirror his desire to control the narrative and also relinquish it as a farewell gesture? Every observer and researcher has a different take, but there is consensus that this final phase showcases a writer in command of his craft, pondering his own mortality. It's no wonder some sources suggest that after concluding his major works, Shakespeare returned to Stratford to enjoy a more peaceful existence, though he still had interests in London. Those who explore his biography see records of land purchases, loans to others, and various activities that depict a man engaged not just in literature, but in practical affairs. This clarifies that being a literary genius didn't stop him from having a grounded approach to ensuring his family's financial well-being. It's a lesson that resonates even today. Extraordinary talent also demands practical organization to flourish amid uncertainty. Shakespeare recognized that, for true creative freedom, a sturdy material base was needed to keep external pressures at bay. Moreover, he never cloistered himself away. He interacted with fellow professionals, discussed scripts, and undoubtedly shared drinks at taverns frequented by artists of the time. This social network helped him remain informed about new trends, critiques, and gossip, continually stoking his creative fire. As a result, he left behind an impressive volume of work, some 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and a number of narrative poems, along with certain texts whose authorship remains debated. This breadth is striking. Rather than sticking to one type of story, he ventured down every conceivable path, depicting everything from teenage loves to large-scale political schemes. With each new text, audiences encountered unforgettable dialogues, lines that would go on to become famous, and characters so lifelike that they felt tangible. Even people who have never read Shakespeare in full have likely encountered quotes or references in modern films, books, or plays. He has become part of pop culture, transcending centuries, languages, and formats. Interestingly, this ubiquitous cultural presence was not something he explicitly planned. His goal was simply to craft compelling stories for audiences of his day. His worldwide legacy ended up the natural consequence of artistic sincerity paired with versatility, traits few have managed to replicate. Throughout such a fertile journey, a deep internal drive moved him, oscillating between optimism and brooding reflections on life and death. In personal terms, Shakespeare lived through joys and frustrations that made him, more than ever, a profoundly complex human being. Married to Anne Hathaway at age 18, she was 26, he stirred all sorts of comments and speculations. Some believe it was a rushed marriage, spurred by Anne's pregnancy, while others detect a deep bond, though poorly understood by many. They had three children, Susanna and the twins Hamnet and Judith. Unfortunately, Hamnet died at 11, something that clearly shook Shakespeare. Even so, he continued writing ceaselessly, splitting his time between London and brief returns to Stratford. Records suggest his routine as a playwright and actor kept him away from his family, likely creating some emotional distance. It's much debated how exactly he and Anne got along. Was it a loving relationship, fraught, or indifferent? His plays don't directly address that, but some perceive traces of his marriage in how he depicted strong female characters or tumultuous relationships. Figures like Lady Macbeth, Desdemona, and Rosalind illustrate intense women who may reflect what he saw or longed for in a partner. There's no proof these parallels are genuine, yet the possibility shows how the bard might have built a bridge between personal life and fiction. Beyond family, he cultivated friendships and rivalries with contemporaries such as Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson. While Marlowe was hailed as a young prodigy, Jonson stood out for a biting wit in prose, fueling healthy competition that enriched Elizabethan theater. Shakespeare, however, maintained his own distinct path, increasingly delving into the psychology of his characters and exploring moral and philosophical dilemmas. In Othello, for instance, he tackled the destructive force of jealousy. In King Lear, he laid bare the cruelty that can arise in familial discord. These powerful dramas gave audiences a collective catharsis, and his fame grew in proportion. Each crest of success, however, brought rumors about his private life, fueled by the lack of solid records. Some claimed he had extramarital affairs or harbored extravagant tastes. Whatever the truth, Shakespeare seemed to address it all through his work. Producing more and more texts, many performed not just at the Globe, but in private theaters that catered to different crowds. By expanding the reach of his plays, he amplified his cultural influence. Even the royal court attended exclusive performances in palaces and special events. Still, it's said that, away from the footlights, he preferred a more discreet demeanor, as though he kept his inner turmoil to himself while unleashing it on stage. This duality, an acclaimed artist who maintained a reserved side, may explain why he could so convincingly portray countless human profiles. He captured communal joys and sorrows, yet also nurtured an introspective spark within himself. It's precisely this paradox that enabled him to pen lines of sublime love in one moment and in the next describe it as a dagger of pain. None of that, though, halted his involvement with local affairs, from lawsuits over taxes to land disputes like any ordinary citizen. In some sense, he moved fluidly between the mundane and the extraordinary, quietly building a legacy that, at the time, few realized would be so immense. Finally, Shakespeare's biography tightens as he approaches his later years, by which time he was a successful man, but also aware of time passing. It's likely that returning to Stratford signaled a desire to manage his assets and enjoy the stability he had earned. In his hometown, he invested in properties and secured a certain social status, far removed from the stereotype of a poor, misunderstood writer. We don't know precisely what his final reflections were, but indications suggest his literary output slowed down in his advancing years. Some believe he collaborated with other playwrights in his final projects, signing fewer solo works. Regardless, his name was solidified. Any play bearing the signature William Shakespeare drew public attention. Intriguingly, a sort of cult around his persona began forming gradually. Although he was not yet revered as he is today, his peers acknowledged his talent, the public adored him, yet Shakespeare's enormous fame was still crystallizing. It was in the following centuries that literary criticism would crown him the greatest dramatist of all time, a pillar of Western culture. In this late stage, he tended to family ties, tied up loose ends, and likely wrote sonnets or personal verses without the demands of enthralling audiences. Composing could have offered him a sense of therapy amid health concerns and a reassessment of what he had or hadn't done. Some speculate he was planning a grand return to the stage, but there's no firm evidence of that. What is clear is that for many, this final period contains a distinct charm, a genius coming home to his roots, seeking perhaps reconciliation or the peace of rural life. One can imagine that after years in London's limelight, Stratford's quiet could have been both a relief and a challenge. It might have been a chance to reread his own texts, pondering themes of destiny, power, love, and death that he knew so well. By that time, Shakespeare remained an ordinary man with worldly concerns, but also a genius capable of shaking the foundations of theater. His official documents, from property deals to lawsuits, reveal a pragmatic side, showing that he was hardly an otherworldly dreamer. This contrast between ordinary man and grand creator reminds us that major artists, too, face everyday problems. Those aspiring to excel in any field can learn from this balance. Achieving global renown doesn't spare you from bills, headaches, or the unforeseen. Shakespeare, like any mortal, walked the fine line between the sublime and the banal, harnessing life's little tensions to fuel his writing. Thus, we find ourselves at an ever more intriguing chapter of his story, the way he chose to end his time in this world. If his life was dominated by ambiguities and contradictions, we can expect his final wishes to be laden with symbolism and subject to various interpretations. After all, the playwright who taught us to doubt appearances was unlikely to leave a straightforward farewell devoid of enigmas. And it is precisely that perspective that bids us to press on, for what follows promises to reveal even more hidden aspects of his intricate mind. The signature will Shakespeare appears unambiguously in his will, but that hasn't stopped conspiracy theories about who truly wrote his works. Some claim the real author was someone else, maybe Francis Bacon or Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. These hypotheses, while sensational, usually lack solid evidence and are viewed by many experts as attempts at stirring controversy. Even so, the existence of his will underscores that he owned assets, properties, and goods he wished to distribute. A less likely scenario if he were nothing but a literary phantom. Still, such theories highlight the fascination he evokes. Why would so many people question the identity of a man who lived on stage and in the documented records of his time? Possibly because the grandeur of his plays seems too astonishing for a humble-born man with no formal university education. But Shakespeare also proves that genius can flourish outside academic halls, nourished by real-life observations and a passion for learning. Within his works lies a cauldron of historical, mythological, and philosophical references, suggesting a voracious reader and a courageous thinker. What's more, he captivated the audience's heart, commanding emotions with impressive skill. That level of talent, of course, feeds the imagination over who he truly was. But most of the academic world agrees that, despite some gaps, he existed and wrote the majority of works that bear his name. In that sense, his will provides further proof. Here was someone who cared about assigning his possessions in a structured way, reinforcing his historical reality. Even so, the figure of the author remains veiled in mystery, for his profound spirituality in writing contrasts with the practicality of certain life decisions. It's curious that, though a successful businessman, Shakespeare didn't flaunt many luxuries, seemingly preferring to invest in real estate rather than lavish displays of wealth. Perhaps he was more focused on securing stability for his family than on projecting an image of grandeur. Anyone reading his sonnets will, by contrast, sense a soul full of contradictions, at times glorifying the eternity of love, at others consumed by jealousy and existential doubt. This paradox suggests that the playwright experienced life as a mosaic, the author of immortal lines, but likewise a citizen entangled in daily affairs. Hence, each tiny choice he made near the end of his life takes on significance, possibly unveiling a previously unknown aspect of his personality. While many wills feel cold and impersonal, his contains a few points that spark centuries of curiosity, especially regarding Anne. That's exactly where differing interpretations abound. Was he expressing affection or disdain for his wife? As we'll see, that nuance sheds light on the complexity of his emotions and fuels debates that continue to this day. By now it's evident that Shakespeare's path was marked by constant ambiguities. The same man who penned iconic lines on love also portrayed internal conflicts and human frailties with striking realism. He knew firsthand the contradictions of a world caught between medieval traditions and Renaissance progress. In his plays, we find fallible kings, wise fools, determined maidens, and villains driven by unfettered passions, a sweeping portrayal of human nature. On a personal level, those contradictions manifested in family relationships and the way he handled his success. His contemporaries saw in him a unique artist, but also a man who skillfully balanced idealism and pragmatism. This duality endured until his final breath, reflected in a will that seems conventional at first glance, yet conceals a puzzling detail. In the opening paragraphs, Shakespeare distributes properties and cares for his family's welfare. Like any responsible head of household, the surprise arrives when he explicitly mentions the so-called second best bed for Anne Hathaway. That seemingly trivial point has sparked centuries of conversation. Was it an insult or an act of love? Why not the best bed or a more valuable item financially? Did this piece of furniture hold intimate memories of the couple? There are theories that, at the time, the best bed was reserved for guests, while the second best was the one the couple actually used. Others see it as a sarcastic twist, a way of saying, take whatever's left. Whatever your perspective, this apparently minor gesture captures the enigma of their relationship and the personality of a playwright who loved to play with symbols. One might say that if the bard was capable of crafting lengthy monologues for his characters, his final message to his wife, just a few words, was an equally deliberate choice. He may have wanted us to interpret it with the same wealth of possibilities that fueled his plays. Only by examining his will more deeply and delving into theories about the bed's meaning can we better grasp the emotional implications. We can also see how every interpretation tells us as much about Shakespeare as it does about his interpreters, since the art of reading the bard is also about projecting our own values and desires onto him. Thus, we reach the point where his life, so rife with contrasts, culminates in the curiosity surrounding his last gesture. To truly understand whether it was a loving token or a subtle barb, we must dissect the historical setting, the era's conventions, and, of course, the subtext that only a wordsmith of his caliber could leave behind. After all, who said the final wishes of a genius would be straightforward or free of riddles? There is still enough mystery left to spur us onward, for as he himself noted in so many lines, truth can take many forms. And, in Shakespeare's view, nothing could be more captivating than shedding light on a modest object brimming with emotional resonance. Brace yourself to discover, in the following topic, why that second-best bed transcends a mere piece of household furniture and becomes a symbol of love, irony, or perhaps something entirely different. Shakespeare lived in an era when legal documents were typically filled with formalities, and his will was no exception. Dated March the 25th, 1616, shortly before his death, it follows the usual structure of legal instruments of the time: lengthy religious remarks, provisions for heirs, specific bequests, and of course, the notorious mention of the second best bed. The document was read and validated right after the playwright's passing on April 23rd, 1616, and it remains an invaluable historical artifact to this day. Although it includes financial details and property distribution for daughters and sons-in-law, the hotly debated point is precisely the brief reference to his wife, Anne Hathaway, who received this peculiar item. The bulk of his material possessions, including the well-known residence at New Place, Stratford-upon-Avon, went to his eldest daughter, Susanna Hall, and other relatives. His younger daughter, Judith, also received sums of money, but in smaller amounts than her sister. It's worth noting that, in the Elizabethan period, property typically passed to heirs deemed capable of upholding the family estate. Against that backdrop, it's intriguing to see that the playwright appears to have specifically reserved a single direct mention for his wife, focusing on this curious piece of furniture. The original wording, as found in one of the preserved versions, states something like, "I give unto my wife my second best bed with the furniture," which some scholars interpret as a deeper meaning than meets the eye. Because it was added in the form of an addendum or codicil, many believe Shakespeare wanted to emphasize something not addressed in the initial drafting. In other words, it wasn't an afterthought carelessly tacked on. It was potentially a deliberate and symbol-laden choice. At the same time, we must recall that legally, Anne Hathaway was entitled to her widow's third, the portion due to her under contemporary marriage laws. Why then explicitly mention the bed? Was the playwright seeking to underscore an emotional bond or make an unexpected statement? The many theories surrounding this detail show how nuanced and complex wills can be. This mention of the second best bed wouldn't be so controversial if Shakespeare weren't, in fact, the master of language. A man capable of writing profound passages on love, tragedy, and comedy might have opted to articulate his affection in a grander way. Instead, he left Anne a mundane object that to many seemed of little worth. It's important to remember, however, that beds in that era were high-value items and status symbols. Generally, the best bed in a house was reserved for guests, while the second best was typically the marital bed. Thus, some experts view this legacy as a sign of affection or an intimate gesture. After all, this could have been the bed where the couple spent much of their married life. Others, though, view it as a far less romantic message. If it truly was the second best, maybe it was simply what remained for Anne, given that the estate at large went to his daughters. Keep in mind that in many cases, the law already provided a widow with certain guarantees, so Shakespeare wouldn't have had to mention her at all if he didn't wish to. And there's the possibility that, for unknown reasons, he intended this mention as an inside joke or a signal that now seems cryptic, but would have been obvious to the couple. Records show the original will underwent a few revisions, and the line about the bed may have been handwritten later, suggesting a near last-minute decision. This supports the theory that the playwright wanted to ensure that particular item remained in Anne's memory, whether for monetary or emotional reasons. The controversy around this reading leads us to ask, in his final act, was Shakespeare being ironic, romantic, pragmatic, or a mix of all three? Scholars from history, literature, and law unite to dissect this document, trying to fathom the bard's true intent. When studied closely, the will reveals not just the bed reference but also other intriguing bequests overshadowed by the fuss. For instance, Shakespeare allocated funds for Stratford's poor, demonstrating his commitment to the local community. He also left small sums to theatrical colleagues like Richard Burbage, John Hemingis, and Henry Condell, meant to buy rings in remembrance. Such gestures indicate that, beyond any dispute over his wife, the author held genuine regard for his neighbors and his artistic circle. Note that, in Elizabethan times, wills frequently had that communal dimension, as securing a proper burial and leaving tokens to friends were socially prestigious moves. So Shakespeare wasn't too far off from custom in including people outside his immediate family. From a modern viewpoint, though, donating a second-best bed to a life partner can appear at least odd, maybe even cold. Yet it's crucial to remember that each clause in the will was tied to a specific context, reflecting the law and cultural norms of the time. Therefore, labeling it as merely an indifferent act might be an oversimplification. Some scholars argue that the bed, along with its fittings, with the furniture referring to not just the frame, but linens and curtains as well, constituted a solid set of belongings, possibly exceeding the presumed worth of just a bed. Either way, that late addition has fueled speculation through the centuries regarding the playwright's real motives. Was it a personal token, or was it his way of ensuring Anne had a symbolic inheritance, while the larger estate was left for those who would manage his literary and financial legacy? Another aspect that stirs debate about the will is the historical relationship between Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. Some claim their marriage was not a grand love affair, pointing out that the playwright spent much of his life in London amid theaters and acting companies, while his wife remained in Stratford-upon-Avon. Also, the circumstances of their union suggest Anne was pregnant with their first daughter, Susanna, when they wed, urgent by the era's standards. Regardless, many letters and documents have vanished over the centuries, making it hard to say whether they lived in harmony or emotional distance. If the will seems somewhat impersonal in naming her, it might reflect that supposed coolness. On the other hand, it's risky to assume that the writer of such passionate verses felt nothing profound for his wife. After all, legal and emotional languages often follow different rules, And it wouldn't be surprising for a poet to save much of his intensity for the stage and the page rather than pour it into legal formalities. In any case, a will was frequently shaped by convention and expediency, leaving room for secrets only the couple would truly understand. This duality aligns with the personality of someone whose plays masterfully portrayed human emotions in ambiguous forms, from the rage of jealousy to the sweetness of reconciliation, from brutal vengeance to near-divine forgiveness. The bed clause might well reflect that spirit, casting a centuries-old shadow of intrigue upon us. Small wonder that Shakespeare's will has become the subject of study not only for historians, but also for psychologists and novelists who see in it a curious snapshot of how the playwright's personal life could have influenced each of his works. Faced with this panorama, it's striking how the bed, or second-best bed, assumed vast proportions in the playwright's posthumous image. Though his will encompasses multiple other provisions, this one short passage has become almost iconic, raising questions about who Shakespeare really was in his most intimate relationships. Some experts hold that the best bed was for guests and social events, while the second best was indeed the couple's true bed, supporting the theory of a love declaration hidden within. Others swear it was a final barb, the man who, in life, endured endless rumors and assumptions, left one last provocative act for his wife. It's one.